Hello, everyone. So this is going to be the third installment for the review tutorial for assignment to the research proposal. So this particular section is just going to review part three, the research questions, and this is going to be short because, like I mentioned, I do have a written example of how this particular section should look like. Okay. So what the okay. So let me just explain the logic as to why I have the research questions or the question sections after the lit review. From prior courses that you've taken, that professor should have explained to you why the lit review is important. What it does, it helps establish you as a legitimate researcher because you're looking for reliable and valid information to use in your particular studies, no matter what the subject matter or intent or the direction that you're going to take that work take that work in. What it also does, it demonstrates to your reader that you're a competent, that your understanding of the literature is at a level where you are competent enough to be able to talk about those readings and to be able to summarize what they say and how you're able to implement those ideas in relationship to your own, while at the same time still focusing on your own ideas in relationship to those sources. So what this does, it helps establish you as a reliable, legitimate writer and researcher. So that's the intent of the literature review. Now, the second part of this is to help you or to show you how you can extrapolate questions from the lit review that will help frame your particular topic. All right, and as I mentioned before, that's what I have for the example. All right. So just to briefly describe what this section is supposed to look like is the first sentence. You're only going to have one sentence. That's going to be the introductory sentence, and it should read something along the lines of the three preliminary research questions that will help either delimit or frame. You decide on the word, either word. The issue of globalization and women, and then you're going to have colon, or sorry, let me rephrase this. So these three preliminary questions will help delimit the issue of how violence is structured towards women on a global scale, and then colon, those are the two dots, and then you're going to double space, and then you're going to list three questions, but the three questions have to be extrapolated in some form or relationship from your lit review. um, Later on, when we start going over, or when I go over the final, the rough draft, that's going to be you're going to be working on like around the end of November. Sorry, end of October, beginning of November is writing out the rough draft and how you put all that stuff together. Okay, but what it does is that you want to make sure that your questions actually relate back to your topic, because sometimes without a certain type of structure, a student can go on tangents, and then the tangents actually undermine your main argument, which is very distracting for your reader, and especially if your reader is well informed on a particular topic. All right, so you always need to imagine that you're not insulting your reader's intelligence, or you're not necessarily um, uh, trying to sort of not consider what the reader is experiencing within the contents of your essay. So it's always important to imagine who your writer is. Okay. So then, by having you do it in this particular way, because sometimes this is what I forgot to mention. And the reason why I'm focusing on questions, because sometimes the questions are much more important, or, no, I shouldn't use that word, much more critical in terms of the part of the reader, how the researcher actually thinks and considers what that topic is, and also the issues that they're addressing. So then in the example that I provide, I wrote three questions that once you read the literature review and then you read the three questions, how those three questions relate back to the literature review as well as the introduction. All right. Now, so then once you list the three questions, I have here or H that you are to explain how your questions frame your object of study. So then what you're going to do is that you're going to write a paragraph, maybe two, but no more than, definitely no more than two paragraphs, but definitely just one paragraph, well written and cohesive, explaining how your questions relate back to your topic. This is a check for yourself to make sure that you're actually asking the proper question in relationship to what you wrote in the literature review as well as in the introduction. As I mentioned before, this is a very particular way of how to write. And this is a way to self check to make sure that you're being consistent and logically writing out your essay, because I do look for logical arguments as well as empirical arguments, right? A professor in the past should have told you the difference. The logical argument is that making sure that your argument is consistent from beginning to end. Empirical logic is making sure that your evidence is supporting your claim, but also making sure that the evidence that you're using is relevant to your topic. Right. And sometimes when students get stressed and they have to write a paper and they don't have enough time, they just select a random article or text and try to force it to make sense. And that's just causing you more harm than good. So this is why I sort of set up these assignments to give you enough time to be able to do good quality work. Okay. And then I just sort of wrote this question that I used in my own book or research for my dissertation. And I only asked like maybe two or three questions, and it helped me write about almost 200 pages. I'm not expecting you to write that much, but I'm just sort of going to explain the logic behind the question. So this is the question that I asked in my dissertation or book that I wrote. How is knowledge historically constituted, but how is knowledge spatially situated? So the question is asking is, well, knowledge is the production of information, or what we could use like a shorthand way, common sense, and what may be considered common sense, right? Um, because each historical moment has a particular set of common sense or predominant ideas of how society is organized, how it's experienced, and how people think about it. So like for example, for someone like me, considering what's happening now, this is not the America that I grew up with, right? When I was like even when I was a grad student at UCSB or as an undergrad at UCSB in the mid to late 90s, right? A lot of this stuff didn't happen with the course of my lifetime, but I did witness that gradual change from the 90s until today. So it took about like what 30 years to be able to get here, right? But that's sort of like my perspective. Right. So then the way that I manage myself today is not how I managed myself yesterday or in the past in terms of how I act or behave in public spaces. So that's what I meant by knowledge is spatially situated. And the other reason why I sort of frame the question this way is to show, or I demonstrate in my book, that knowledge that is produced within the communities that we come from, which is working class communities of color, do produce and acquire knowledge. So it's one way of how to reaffirm um, barrio or hood identity, right? Because just because you're in the born and raised in the barrio or born and raised in the hood does not necessarily mean you have to grow up with a barrio or hood mentality, a la Ice Cube's song "Hood Mentality." Right, so it's an interesting song if you haven't heard it. So I would definitely recommend that you listen to it. It is very he uses a lot of profanity, but I use that song actually in my introductory to sociology courses. Right. But anyway, So that's not necessarily pertinent to this situation. But anyway, so then this is how you are able to construct questions that are directly associated or extrapolated from your particular subject matter. All right. So then that's why this section is important, and this is why the research question section follows the lit review. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, if it doesn't make sense, please let me know either in class or send me an email. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here and then do the last installment that's going to review part 4, the outcome.